Hi, everybody. I'm Kathy Kiely, the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. And I am here this afternoon in the studios of the Reynolds Journalism Institute with my colleague Taylor Freeman, a recent master's degree recipient from the Missouri School of Journalism. Congratulations, Taylor.
Thank you.
And an anchor on KOMU 8. And those of you who have been with us live have been seeing Taylor sometimes doing some of our questions. So we're here together today for the last session of this 2022 edition of Friends of the Facts. And we've got somebody pretty great to bring up the grand finale, our colleague Monique Luisi, who is a PhD, and I want to get into that PhD. She is part of our journalism studies faculty here at the Missouri School of Journalism. And Monique, you did your PhD on sort of a form of, I would say, misinformation or disinformation on social media and how that affected vaccination rates in Kansas, where you were getting your PhD at an institution we won't mention. No, it's Kansas University, University of Kansas. So our rival and friendly rival from the other side of the border. So I want you to tell us a little bit about, I know you've got some slides, and I know you're going to talk about this, just how you got into this line of research. So take it away.
Sure, and thank you, Kathy and Taylor, for having me here today. This is really exciting, and I hope I do the wrap-up presentation justice. But so going back to Kansas, how I got started on this dissertation topic was kind of a happy accident, but not so happy. So one of the coolest things about research and what I get to do is that I get to study topics that interest me or have some relevance to my life, and this project was no different. So my sister, who is okay with me telling this story, she has two daughters, and they're 10 years apart. And when the elder daughter, it was time for her to get her HPV vaccine, the doctor recommended that she should get it if she was probably going to be sexually active early. Well, pretty much I would imagine most parents would react to somebody telling them that their 9-year-old might be sexually active early, might just go, or immediately lose interest in something like that and decide to delay vaccination till later. And that is what my sister ended up ultimately doing. But with her younger daughter, the pediatrician explained that the vaccine prevented cancer. And before that interaction, my sister did not know that. So that was something that I always carried with me. And I really didn't know that I was going to get into this topic until a news article came out that Kansas had tied for the lowest rate of HPV vaccination. It would
And
believe
I'm
it
going
was
to
in
interrupt.
2015.
Can I interrupt, Travis?
Yeah.
To just say, let's just, for people who might not know, because I don't know about you, Taylor, but I'm not an expert on medical stuff. So just for folks who don't have kids, this is kind of a newer vaccine. Can you explain what the HPV vaccine is and what it's for?
Absolutely. So the HPV vaccine is the vaccine that protects people against the human papillomavirus. And the human papillomavirus is actually a group of many different viruses, but the most common ones that infect people can cause genital warts and several forms of cancer. And it's important to know that these cancers can occur in both men and women. So some of them in both, some of them in one, some of them in others, but they include cervical, vulvar, vaginal, penile, anal, and cancers of the mouth and throat, the oropharyngeal cancers.
And these are cancers that show up later, right? They're not.
Yes.
Yeah. So when people get older, they get these cancers.
Yes, they can occur in younger people, but they do typically occur later in ages, which is one of the challenges of the vaccine, because It's recommended that children ages 11 and 12 years old get the vaccine. The goal being that they'll get vaccinated before they engage in any sexual activity. But children as early as age 9 are eligible to get the vaccine.
And so, and like you say, people don't, just like kids don't want to think about their parents having sex, parents are probably even worse, right? In total denial
Yes.
that this is ever going to happen.
Certainly.
Right. And I completely empathize. It's not the most wonderful thing to think about, but neither's cancer. So if one way you can look at it is you get the child the vaccination and you never have to think about it again, and hopefully you never have to think about any of these cancers occurring in your child.
So you saw this, and I gather what you're talking about in your sister's case is she got very different messages from the physicians with her two children. One was couched in, maybe your kid's going to have sex pretty soon, and the other was, maybe we can avoid cancer.
Yes. And that goes into not just misinformation, because that's not necessarily misinformation, but messaging and how we can strategically package messaging to appeal to our audience, because a message is only good if an audience is willing to receive it. And so that was one way that the messaging was not necessarily curated in the best form, but misinformation really took hold over the representation of this vaccine. So the incident with my sister is kind of what put my eye, like with the radar, put HPV vaccinations on the radar, because I was like, oh, this is cool, a vaccine that can prevent cancer. And it makes sense that once you know that you would get it. But when I saw the article announcing that Kansas had tied for the lowest vaccination rate of the states in the United States, I was really baffled, because I was just like, oh, there's a vaccine that prevents cancer, which is a very devastating condition. And so why would parents elect not to get their children something that can prevent cancer? And most of the research at that time had focused mostly on young women, so young adult women. So this excluded lots of people, children. Oftentimes, people may begin sexual activity before they're 18. So there's that group of people who are missing. And also, there was a lot of research that out there, but they didn't look at parents and how parents were influenced by social media in particular. And I used to be a very avid Facebook user, not so much now, but back then I was just like, oh, okay, let's look online and see what's going on. And I was shocked to see how poorly the HPV vaccine was represented online. But to give you a little context, at the time, when I began this research, across the country, only 6 out of 10 girls had began getting the HPV vaccine series. And at one time it was a 3-dose series, and now it's 2. And only 5 out of 10 boys were getting the HPV vaccine across the nation. And you can see Kansas is the lighter the color, the lesser the vaccination rates. In both instances, Kansas and Missouri had relatively low vaccination rates. And if we break it down just by Kansas in particular, we see that for the young women, that they ranked pretty low, all 30 in the 30s and below for getting vaccination rates, for getting the HPV vaccine rates. And same thing for young men. In many cases, it was worse, because for young men, it was all in the 40s. So that just made me wonder, again, not to keep repeating myself to the point of exhausting the audience, I really wanted to know why the HPV vaccine, or how the HPV vaccine was represented on social media, because I was particularly curious if social media was something that was influencing people's health decisions. Most adults use the internet, and now it doesn't, age is kind of less of a factor. It used to be that social media was for kids. Now social media is for everyone. So it just became something that I was really curious about. And the unique thing about Facebook was that Facebook first debuted in 2004, and the HPV vaccine wasn't approved by the FDA until 2006, the first iteration of it, and it wasn't available for boys and men until 2009. So because Facebook predates the FDA approval of the HPV vaccine, there was a unique opportunity to look at the representation of it from its genesis, and that was pretty cool.
Do you have any idea how many? I mean, we'd have to go back and look, but in 2006, when this vaccine first became available, any idea, Monique, how many users were on Facebook at the time? Because as we know, it grew from a few of Mark Zuckerberg's friends at Harvard to a worldwide platform pretty quickly. But do you have any idea how many there were?
I would have to go back and look in the archives, but it was I believe, in the millions. It might have been actually the number 1.1 billion sticks out, but again, I would fact check that.
I have a question about the correlations of Facebook and the HPV vaccine coming out at similar times. Do you know, or was there anything you found in your research that could show who might be spreading this misinformation? Was it people operating what they believed was they were doing their best, or was this actual purposeful disinformation that was going out?
That's a good question, and that's not something that is easily decipherable, but I do want to share the results from the study with you that kind of gets a little bit into it. So what I found mostly in my research...
I'm going to interrupt because I found the answer to that one question I just posed. I'm looking at a timeline I keep. In December 2006, there were 12 million users of Facebook. So, and that's pretty remarkable when you consider that was launched 2 years before. So it went from 0 to 12 million in 2 years. Of course, now we're in the billions. But sorry, I just wanted to add that piece of context.
No, thank you. Billion must be now.
Yes.
Or something. Yes. But yeah, back it was millions, and now we're in billions. It's incredible. So with the research, what I found was, well, first, I wanted to see how many posts I could find, and I found a lot. There were thousands. I think I found, and you also have to keep in mind, in the time that we were doing this, that I was doing this research, that Facebook had just did the infinity scroll, so you could scroll and scroll and scroll, and then I would scroll and scroll and scroll until my computer crashed. And I found somewhere in the neighborhood of 18,000 posts from 2006 to 2016, and collected a subsample of that. So I analyzed and curated over 6,500 Facebook posts, and from 2006 to 2016, and largely overall, we found that I found overall that the representation of the HPV vaccine became more negative over time. At the beginning, the representation was actually pretty positive, because it was mostly the messages were generated by people who have had experience with cancer, or companies affiliated with this. And then it was just like, yay, we have a vaccine that prevents cancer. But as far as who was spreading the information, and I think that's a really good question, in the beginning, it seemed like organizations were spreading information, and then individuals. But then after individuals, it became groups. But these dynamics have ebbs and flows over time because of Facebook's privacy issues. So I only analyzed publicly available posts. And in the beginning, everybody's profile was connected. You could only have a profile if you had a university account. And then you had friends, and you didn't have to have a university account. And then you had your posts posted to the public, and then you had the option of changing whether the public could see them or not. And then you could post to other people's walls, and then later you could post to your own wall and everybody could see it. And then we had groups, and groups over time have become very influential over social media. And that is the really tricky part about the health information too, because some of these pieces of information that are shared by people and groups, I truly think that what they're saying is correct. And in that case, it's not disinformation. It could start off as disinformation, but then turn into, by definition, misinformation if you have somebody who is well-meaning, well-intended, who's sharing this information asking, is it true? Is this something that could hurt my kid? And the most distressing thing about this whole social media climate is that posts, regardless of how one may feel about the HPV vaccine or anything related to it, posts that were more negative in nature had the most momentum. So I want to show you the post that had the most traffic in the study that I found at the time. Here we see a post from a Facebook group called Cancer Truth. And if you're looking at this at just, first glance, it seems like a legitimate page. But the post goes on to claim via a testimony that someone lost their daughter because of the HPV vaccine. And it has a picture of these beautiful young women who allegedly died from getting the HPV vaccine. And in the middle, the caption says that the HPV vaccine kills more girls than the cancers that HPV vaccine prevents. So when you see a message like this, you have the picture, you have the narrative, the heart-wrenching testimony of somebody who lost their daughter. Even though this is misinformation and probably disinformation by the original authors, this is really deep and emotional, and something that could even give the most savvy Facebook user pause to think about, is this thing that I'm putting in my child's body something safe? Is it something that's effective? Am I doing the best job as a parent? But this post it was generated in 2014. So by the time I had analyzed it at the time, but in 2016, it had gotten over 11,000 reactions and 6,100 comments, but it had been shared over 300,000 times. And so just think about every time somebody shares a post, how many people see it. If it's shared 329,000 times on public and private forums, that's a huge audience.
Yeah, because to explain that, this is a share by, you can share this with your friends. So it's really a multiplier effect. Every time somebody shares it, their friends are seeing it. And as Monique pointed out, and a lot of these groups now are private. So this is what I think some of our speakers earlier talked about, the walled garden. So we can't always, that's one of the challenges I think that Friends of the Facts have. Certainly. Is that we can't see everything that's being posted out there anymore. And so it's harder to really get a handle on just how much misinformation or disinformation is out there. And just to be clear, misinformation is what Monique is describing when somebody unwittingly shares information that may not be reliable, but they have received it from a friend, and so someone they trust. Disinformation is when someone is actively, like Vladimir Putin, he's my favorite whipping boy these days, are putting false information out that they're hoping will cause you to act in a way that is really deleterious to your health or somebody else's health. So
knowingly false information.
Knowingly false,
right.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Right, and that's the danger with social media, is that you have disinformation become misinformation. And also that's why how we share information is very important, and who shares the information is important because of that credibility. And as you were saying, yes, there's a lot of pockets of social media and other media which aren't necessarily archivable by researchers or even some curious person who wants to know more. If things are in the walled garden, they're inaccessible, so we don't really also know the spread and reach of all this information. But in some ways, it may be safe to assume that it's more than what you see, because what we're seeing is only what's available to the public. So in particular, so going back to Kansas, because I looked at the history of the HPV vaccine over 10 years and how it was represented over social media. But I was living in Kansas at the time, and I really was curious about how Kansan parents may have been influenced by social media. So what I did was I surveyed them to ask them their perceptions about the HPV and the HPV vaccine. And what I found was pretty interesting. I found that there were about 1/5 of respondents who disagreed with the statement that I support the HPV vaccine. So that kind of gave me some insight into the population that I was working with at the time, that there was definitely some hesitancy, some concern, some anti-feelings against the HPV vaccine for a number of reasons. Before I began the formal survey, I did interview a number of people, and some of the parents and guardians were saying that they felt that their child did not need to get the HPV vaccine because they would be protected by God, and that God would give them a good partner, and that they would be safe. Other people were concerned about the vaccine ingredients, and they weren't sure if it was safe, and they wanted to know if there were alternative, more natural remedies to prevent HPV. So it was just really interesting to see the divided and the amount of anti-HPV vaccine sentiment that existed in Kansas at the time. And so in the survey, I found a lot of interesting results, but overall, the parents that I surveyed were very aware that HPV is a common STI. In fact, it's the most common STI, and more. Basically, the CDC says that if you're ever sexually active in your lifetime, you probably will get HPV. So, not the most comforting piece of information, but fortunately we have a vaccine to protect against it. So the issue wasn't that parents didn't know about HPV. It wasn't that they didn't know that the vaccine existed, and they knew that HPV was connected with cancer. They also weren't necessarily disputing that the vaccine had benefits, but they were concerned that the consequences of the vaccine were greater than the benefits, and that the vaccine was risky.
And risky as in the ingredients, and also what they believe maybe their daughters would then be willing to do. Like what necessarily is the risk that they were citing?
Daughters and sons.
Okay.
And yes, and their children who they're being guardians for. We want to be inclusive. So that being said, the consequences included whether the vaccine causing disability, because at the time, throughout this course of time, there was also a bunch of videos on YouTube that were going viral about young girls having seizures, and saying that it was because of the HPV vaccine that this was happening. People were concerned that it was like a license for their child to be sexually active. Like, oh, okay, if you're safe against HPV, then you don't need to wait or something like that. But there was a landmark study, I think, that by some Canadian researchers that showed pretty conclusively that people who got the HPV vaccine were no more sexually active than anybody else. So that was comforting.
And Monique, could you see from what you were watching online, how much did the parents and guardians' concerns mirror what you were seeing on social media? I mean, could you make a cause and effect connection there?
I would want to do more statistics about it, but from my vantage point, from what I was seeing in Kansas, the vaccine ingredients concern did come up a lot, but Kansas, being a more conservative state, a lot of the concerns that the parents were expressing also did have to do with behavioral outcomes that their children may have, but most of the concern was around the ingredients of vaccines and what they were putting into their children's bodies.
And in some ways, your research for your dissertation really foreshadowed what we have been seeing more recently with COVID. So what does your research teach us about how we should communicate around vaccines or really any major health issues when you're having a worldwide pandemic or a worldwide kind of health crisis? Can you draw any conclusions on what should we not do and what should we do?
Absolutely. So I had no idea, and no one had any idea, I really think, that when in 2017, when I was wrapping this up, that we would be here in 2020, 2022, dealing with a global pandemic. So in the end, the first thing I would say that we need to take away from this is that social media really is a source of information, influence, and news, regardless of how we may feel about it. As I was finishing up my Kansas study, I did have one more question that I wanted to assess, because I didn't want to just look at whether or not Kansan parents were looking at social media, but how it was influencing them and how they engage with social media about the HPV vaccine. And what I found was that social media was a source. It wasn't the most trusted source, but it definitely did have its influences. And among the findings, there was a significant statistical relationship between those parents who had seen information on social media about the HPV vaccine and thinking that the vaccine could kill their kids. Now, the fascinating thing about this is that most of the parents thought, they said that social media was not affecting their decisions. But research shows and has shown time and time again that we are subject to the third person effect, or that we believe that media influences others more than it influences ourselves. So taking that now to 2022, I do think it is so important that we are aware of the media that we're consuming, because we're not necessarily really good judges and assessors of how media influence us. But we can take steps to curate our media and to make sure that we are taking active steps to get media from trusted sources. But speaking about COVID, me and the National Association of Broadcasters and the Reynolds the Reynolds Journalism Institute had a wonderful opportunity to work on a study to look at the influence of local media and information about COVID and COVID vaccinations. And some of these results that we found actually kind of speak to the work I was doing back in 2017. People really want information, but people don't necessarily want to be told what to do. And this makes me think of that post that I showed you earlier. It presented all this information that was negative about the HPV vaccine, but it didn't go as far as to tell people don't get the HPV vaccine. It just kind of planted that seed of doubt and fear and kind of let the rest take shape. But more and more,
I'm curious, is that almost more effective than just saying don't do this? Do you think that planting that seed almost creates a bigger level of fear?
Absolutely. Because it's like, you don't have to take it from me, but if you want to take that risk, go ahead. That kind of seems a little more ominous. But also, I can't help but wonder, at least in the United States, and that's one thing I have to say, that these studies were limited to the United States. We're very prideful in our independence and our freedom. And take a lot of pride in not being told what to do. So I do think that there are some cultural variables in there, and that when you tell people what to do, especially people who strive for independence and freedom, it has sort of a whiplash effect of like, no, I'm not, and people double down in their own beliefs. So you can lead people to the
Sorry, you talked about elitism. I think that's definitely a factor here. Can you expand on that a little bit, this sense of not wanting to be told by an elite what to do?
Yeah.
Yes, and so that's something that has been even more of a feature that we're seeing in research ever since former President Trump's administration. And the way we perceive power in society and who we believe in changes over time. Once upon a time, not that long ago, the power for medicine and medical influence lay more heavily in doctors and scientists. But we're seeing that change, and that's for a number of things. People have bigger voices, and some of them are valid because there have been issues in the medical community. There has been racism, sexism, and a bunch of different issues that are legitimate. But then there's also been other cultural movements and ideas that have become more pervasive. This idea that certain medicines aren't natural and being closer to nature is healthier. So we've had a confluence of information, which has resulted in now that in the question of, do I trust this person who is a spokesperson for all, or are the elite institutions, do they have ulterior motives? And should I trust my local pharmacist, or should I trust my local news program who knows me and knows my people and knows my situation? And we found in our research that with the COVID research, that local news is so important to influencing people and getting information out there. So the power now is local, which is concerning insofar as local media is being shuttered more and more. If I'm correct, that's not my expertise
No,
area.
you're correct. And we had a slide in one of our earlier presentations today about the news desert, and Penny Abernathy, a former reporter and now a scholar, has done pioneering work in this area, and she's just introduced a new iteration of that study, and she really was the first person. She's at Northwestern University, who pointed out that a lot of local news outlets are shutting down. And certainly in a state like ours, we're very fortunate in Columbia because we have a lot of media outlets, because a lot of them are powered by the Missouri School of Journalism and our students. But you don't have to go very far, even in our own neck of the woods, to get to a place where it's very difficult to find local news. And I will just say, Monique, I think you and I have talked a little bit about this, but during the first summer of COVID, my colleague Damon Kiesau and I funded a project where some of our students went to work covering COVID. And we went into news deserts and got on Facebook groups and told people about research and tips coming from our University of Missouri School of Medicine. And I think some of it was favorably received, but some of the students got real pushback. And here's the ultimate irony. For a short time, we were in Facebook jail because they were sending out so many messages that they became a target of suspicion.
That you're a bot?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we were trying to do the right thing, and Facebook identified us as suspicious actors. So this is a very difficult landscape to navigate. And I wonder, Monique, if in the work you're doing with the National Association of Broadcasters and other institutions, what are you telling people about what's the most effective way to get a message across so that people can stay healthy?
That's a very good question. And I kind of want to go back to what you were talking about with getting pushback from the with the University of Missouri students working and you all working in those news deserts. So elitism in a way is a matter of perspective. And depending on even the university's reputation with communities, the university may come off as an elitist institution. So what is the best thing to do? Social media is really, I don't want to say that social media is the big evil. Social media is really, really good at raising awareness and has been used to do some wonderful things for some wonderful groups and wonderful causes. But with the good comes the bad. And when it comes to social media, while it is a powerful source of information that has influence, it's not the most influential source. So it takes work, but that work results in some very favorable outcomes. And specifically, that work involves finding who are the influencers in the community, who are those trusted individuals, and if possible, having more direct face-to-face communication, and also having that communication come from the sources that people can relate to. People respond well to people that they identify with, whether it be, oh, I want to hear from a parent. I don't want to hear from a celebrity talking about what they think about vaccines, that unless they have kids, which might give them more gravitas. But you want to hear from people who have your shared experiences, people who you can resonate with. That builds trust and that builds rapport. The local community health workers are very important. Often nurses, these individuals are so important because they usually are the first people that that community members will encounter, because they may not necessarily have a face-to-face interaction with a doctor or their primary care provider, but they'll definitely have interactions with nurses and community workers and so on. So I wish I had easier answers for everyone, but really it's the hard work here is the best work. Making sure that there's local news sources that are trusted and reliable and available to people really helps. And being out there on the ground is very fundamental to building trust, to building rapport, and getting good information out there.
We have on the call, I mean, on our session, I know a lot of people, some of them are here now live, and others I think will be joining asynchronously at their own leisure. But a lot of people who are registered for this conference are teachers and librarians who I consider to be potential clarions, you know, people going out extra, you know, they are news sources in a way, trusted sources in their communities. So do you have any specific advice for people who are teaching in elementary or secondary schools about how to communicate with their students, how to communicate with parents? Because I think you very correctly identified parents in this transaction as they're the deciders, you know, they get to decide whether their kid is vaccinated. And then librarians who are dealing with the public on a regular basis every day. Anything that you've learned from your research that would help them?
So with my research and with many conversations that I've had with many people, one thing that I realized is that respect is key. Referring back to what I mentioned earlier, people don't necessarily want to be told what to do, but they're happy to receive information so that they can make up their own minds about how they feel best to protect their health and the health of their loved ones. In that, it's important to remember that these oftentimes are not going to just be one-off interactions, that these are conversations and interactions that are establishing rapport, hopefully not creating mistrust, and that you're building this relationship so that you can provide guidance. And when it comes to health, people have very strong opinions, and it's hard not to, especially in the time of COVID when over hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people around the world have died. It's hard not to have a strong opinion about vaccination and how to prevent the spread of disease. But we if we want to influence people, we have to remember that we can have our strong opinions, but we don't want to talk at people, but we want to meet people where they are. So if you're having an occasion to talk about disease and health with kids, one of the most effective strategies could just be to listen first and ask questions. Because in the case of the HPV vaccine, so much of the campaign was about spreading awareness, but the issue wasn't awareness. People knew about the HPV vaccine. People knew what HPV could do. The problem was that people thought that the vaccine was more dangerous than the HPV itself. So if we had the answer to a question that we didn't ask before, it would have been easier to get ahead of that. So communicating about disease and health and everything involved in that is more than just talking, but listening to figure out what our audiences need. Because if we know what they need, then it's going to be easier to connect and influence.
What do you do, and maybe you can model this for us, what do you do if somebody comes to you and they say, Monique, I'm not getting my kid vaccinated. I mean, I saw these girls, they were having seizures on YouTube. I'm just not doing it. What do you say to that person? Do you let that opinion out there, or how do you contradict, or is that too condescending? I mean, show us how to have these conversations.
Oh, that's such a hard calculus because there's so many factors. I'm like, who is this person in relation to me? Did I meet them off the street? Do I know them somehow, some way? But assuming that, like, I just gave this talk and somebody came up to me and I would be like, what about this person felt like they felt that they needed to tell me about this? Like, how did this come up? And then but generally, I think the first thing I would say is, I would acknowledge their fear, acknowledge that their fear, the information, well, I'm acknowledging that the fear that they have of their kid getting sick is legitimate. That's legitimate fear. And saying, I totally would be nervous about putting something in my body or my children's body if I heard this too. Then I would start asking questions and saying, oh, you heard about this? Okay, where did you hear it from? And then ask them a little bit more about, do they trust that source? And, what has their doctor said about it? Maybe you might want to talk to a doctor. Maybe you might want to talk to a local community health worker. Just kind of gently usher them into that area. And then also, just acknowledge, I respect you. I understand that we have a shared goal, and that shared goal is to make a healthy community, and that you're on your own journey on figuring that out. Now, that's not to say that in the back of my head, I'm not thinking, because we're human and we have strong opinions. But, nobody likes being badgered, and nobody likes being told, you're dumb for your opinion. And that's just a really quick way to lose an audience. So, I mean, I know there's also things that I believe in that to other people may seem absolutely absurd. That's part of the joy and the tragedy of being human. But also, this unique ability that we have as humans is the ability to communicate and to reason. And if we use that a little bit more, I feel like we could get a lot further.
I want to, before we wrap up, I want to highlight one thing you said because it connects to an earlier message from some of our other speakers. And then I also want to ask you a question about your own social media use. But the thing I wanted to highlight was, two things really. One, you pointed out how much negativity sells online. And one of our speakers talked earlier, used this great phrase that I'm going to steal over and over again, although I'll give her credit. Philippa Hughes was our speaker who used it. She talked about the polarization industrial complex. And I think the reality is what we know, I think, Taylor, you know this from being in the news business, that the more dramatic or tragic a story, the more people are going to look at it. And so there is a profit motive to put that stuff out there, and that is on steroids on social media.
Certainly.
And so we're going to see a lot of negativity out there, and so I think that gives us one more warning sign to think about. Is it really as bad as it seems? Or am I just buying into this story because I am, as a human being, I am programmed to fret and worry and see threats everywhere and try to avoid them. And the second thing you talked about was how people can share this information and affect other people, can sometimes share disinformation without realizing that it's disinformation. And I think that if we have one message that comes out of this conference, I think one of the most important things is you are all publishers. Start to think like reporters, meaning, should I be publishing this? Do I have all the facts? Have I checked for multiple sources? What would you do, Taylor, if you were on KOMU tonight and you had a story that, well, women are having seizures because of vaccines?
We got to check some sources. You know, we got to make sure that we're going to, because obviously as a publisher, we can't air things that are factually incorrect. Otherwise, we're on the hook. So obviously with Monique's research she's doing, all these people that are on Facebook, obviously they don't care. They're not on the hook for anything. So yeah, the lack of checking sources, not good. Very not good.
And Monique, what about you? You mentioned that you used to be a big Facebook user, not as much now. You talked about curating what you're getting on social media, which I think is smart. I mean, social media is here to stay. How do you, as somebody who's really smart and looked into this, done a lot of research, do you have any tips for people who are watching now on what they should do, how to handle this to make it a productive part of your life, but not a corrosive one?
That is so hard. And I'm not going to sit here and act like it was a enlightening moment and I was like, oh, I'll turn it off. It was really a journey. And it actually wasn't my dissertation that dissuaded me from using Facebook. It was actually my husband's research. So my husband is a professor who looks at the relationship that children have with media. And there's a bunch of research coming out talking about the negative influences that social media can have on people. And so I just kind of sat down over the course of a couple of months and reflected over how did my social media use make me feel? Like, yes, I felt connected to the world in a way, but was that connection something genuine? And was it something just that was immediate gratification? Or was it something that I was like, oh, I'm revved up and I'm sad, or I'm revved up and angry, or I'm revved up about something that I don't consider to be part of my value system. So after thinking about that a lot, I just decided, okay, well, I deleted my Facebook profile. I still have one for research purposes, but it doesn't have any friends on it. It's just so I can look up things. But also, because a lot of businesses are on Facebook, it's still useful to have that around. But yeah, no feed, no friends, nothing on that. And with other social media sites like Instagram, there's a lot of cool stuff on there. Looking at puppies, I like looking at animal and nature videos. But there's also some stuff that makes me feel bad, like stuff that talks about beauty standards or hustle culture, which I realized made me feel bad. And that's not what I need to feel in my life, and that's not how I want to feel. So it did need to be part of my social media journey. So that's just a little bit inside. And also I keep a timer admittedly, I keep a timer on my phone for my social media use and look at it every week just to kind of keep a heads up on it, because I am aware that social media any media influences how I feel. Anything that I expose myself to, it's kind of like food. You put into your body and it affects your body. Same thing with our media. It definitely does our media diet definitely influences how we think and how we feel.
I'm curious on a personal level, Monique, after your research, when you completed your research and then boom, the pandemic, came upon you. How do you feel now after all this? Are you hopeful? Do you feel like this is something that we can overcome? Is bad information about vaccines and medical information in general? Because I mean, we're obviously specifically focusing on vaccines, but this could be any medical treatment, anything. So are you hopeful that we can overcome this?
Just with that sucking of my teeth, I feel like I took too long to answer. I feel hopeful that there are answers to it, but I'm trying to figure out how the best it is. I am concerned because I feel like the answers that we have are not necessarily answers that we want. It is so efficient and quick to put out information on social media to combat social media information. But that's not necessarily the best, most effective tool to work. We have the means, we have the people, and we have the skills to get at that interpersonal information. And yes, it takes more work and it's longer, but the outcome of it is so much more rich and so much more effective than posting anything on social media to combat misinformation many times. So I know we have the tools, we have the know-how, but do we have the motivation? That's the question. Because I don't know about you, but I'm tired from this pandemic, and that's just saying the least of it. And I'm sure many other people are tired and worn out too. But it does take that hard work to get to where we want to go. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I know we can do it. But the question is, will we?
Well, that is a really great question to end this session on, because I think that is the big question in front of us. We have the wherewithal, we have the know-how. Will we do this? One of my favorite Americans, even though she's a meme, is Rosie the Riveter. And I always think about Rosie with that muscle and saying, we can do it. And I think we can do it. But I think in order to do it, we have to have that can-do spirit. And so we've talked a lot about fatigue and depression, really, among people who are teachers, librarians, journalists, because we have been on the front lines of this information revolution. And I don't know if you'd call it hopeful, but I feel like I'm in a race. And I think that the knowledge is out there. I think we have the ability, as you say, Monique, to beat this. But I feel like there's this big avalanche coming right behind us, and we have to run, so that we don't get buried first. And so that is why I'm really grateful to all the people who are participating today, either live or later and asynchronously on our conference. I'm really grateful to Monique for being here and helping us wrap up Friends of the Facts 2022. And so I'm going to say thank you to Monique and tell her that she can go off and relax, because it sounds like you need it for the rest of the afternoon. Take a rest, because we need you back on the battlefront, so don't rest too long.
Thank you, and I hope you get rest too. Thank you for having me here today.
All right. Thank you, Monique.
Thank you.